Dear children, now we are moving on to the second part of the chapter, that is supply. We will be learning the difference between individual supply and market supply, the law of supply, factors affecting the individual and market supply, elasticity of supply and degrees of elasticity of supply, change in quantity supplied and change in supply. The same, all the topics that we have learned for demand will be repeated for supply. Now let us begin with the definition of supply and few concepts of supply in this video. What is meant by supply? How do you define supply? Supply refers to the quantity of a commodity that a firm is willing. Instead of firm, you can write producer. If it is demand, we will use the term consumer. Okay? A firm is willing and able to sell. If it is a consumer, we will be using buy. Demand is buy, isn't it? At a given price during a given period of time. So, the only change in the definition between demand and supply is, in demand we will be using buying and consumers, but in supply you will be using either firms or producers and selling the commodity. So, how will you define supply? Once again, supply refers to quantity of a commodity that a producer or a firm is willing and able to sell at a given price during a given period of time. At a particular price, how much quantity that a firm is able to sell during a given period of time, that is known as supply. Now, just as we have learned for demand, there are two types of supply. One is individual supply and the other one is market supply. Now, when we speak about individual supply, we can write the definition from the previous definition we have learned. The same definition you can write. The supply refers to individual supply. Here you can add individual supply. Refers to the quantity of a commodity that a firm or a producer is willing and able to sell at a given price during a given period of time. So, as it is individual supply, you can specify it as a firm, that is known as individual supply. So, the same supply definition can be repeated for individual supply. Now, how will you define a market supply? When you write about market supply, you have to use the term sellers or firms or producers. From this definition itself, we can write the definition for market supply. Instead of individual, you can make it as market. Market supply refers to the quantity of a commodity that the firms or producers or sellers are willing and able to sell at a given price during a given period of time. So, that is the only difference between market supply and individual supply. In individual, it is only one firm or a seller or a producer, but whereas in market supply, it is firms, producers or sellers. Okay. Now, the next important topic that we have to learn is, what are the factors influencing the individual supply? Individual supply, the producer to produce and sell in the market, he will be influenced by some factors. Let us see what are the determinants of individual supply. Just as we have learned for determinants of individual demand and market demand, you will be learning the determinants of individual supply and market supply. Now, let us see what are the factors which determines the individual supply. What are the factors which influences the producer to supply in the market? The first factor is the price of a commodity. How will you define that? Always the price of a commodity is directly related to the supply. You have learned in demand, price of a commodity is inversely related to demand, isn't it? When the price increases, demand will be less, and when the price decreases, demand will be more. But it is just opposite in the case of a seller. When a seller will be tempted to produce more, if the market price of a commodity is more, isn't it? So, we can say there exists a positive relation between price and supply. So, what kind of a relation between price and supply? Positive relation between price and supply, which means when the price increases for a commodity, the producer will increase the supply with the aim of maximizing the profit. So, he is very happy if the price of the commodity rises in the market, he will get that much of profit. if he sells the produce in the market. So, when the price increases, sellers will increase the production. Now, prices of other goods, for example, rice and wheat. If a producer is producing rice and wheat, now when he finds that the price of the wheat is increasing in the market, slowly he will replace the land for producing the wheat instead of rice. Therefore, price of one particular commodity is not the factor which influences the supply. Prices of other commodities also influences the supply. A producer who was supplying rice for a long time or a particular period of time will shift his production from rice to wheat, seeing that the price of the wheat has increased than rice. So, he will be using the land for the production of wheat instead of rice, and he will start supplying wheat instead of rice. So, prices of other commodities also influences supply. Next is prices of factors of production. You know that for the production process to undergo, so many factors are required like land, labor, capital, organization, raw materials. For producing certain commodities, all the commodities we need raw materials, isn't it? If the prices of raw materials are very high, it is not profitable for the producer to supply more in the market. At that time, what the producer will do? Producer will try to cut short his production for that commodity because raw materials are costly. So, the profit or margin will be very less for him. So, if the prices of raw materials or factors are very high, producer will reduce the supply. If the prices of factors are less, producer will supply more. Next is state of technology. If the technology is advanced, what is the advantage? Cost of production will be less. More can be produced within a short period of time using less power, less number of labors, etc. So, if the technology is advanced, the producer will supply more. But if the technology is obsolete, what will happen? Only less can be produced with more time, more number of labors will be needed to operate the machine, etc. Therefore, if the technology is obsolete, producer will supply less. Now, the next factor is government policies. Government policies play a very important role in supply process. Now, if the government is giving very favorable tax concessions and subsidies to the producers, producers will be encouraged to produce more and more in the market. Therefore, supply will be more if the government policies are favorable. If the government policies are not favorable, supply will be less. Next factor is objectives of a firm. Now, normally what is the objective of a firm or a producer? Profit maximization. So, for profit maximization, he will try to sell more or less accordingly, isn't it? But there are certain firms who are very much concerned about their prestige or status in the economy, okay, in the society. Therefore, even if the price is less, they will try to produce more in the market so that they will keep up their status and prestige. Otherwise, there will be a negative feeling that the firm is undergoing in a loss. So, in order to keep up that social status and prestige, they will be supplying more in the market even if its price is less. So, all these are the factors which influences the individual supply. So, the factors which influences individual supply are price of a commodity, prices of other goods, prices of factors of production, state of technology, government policies and objectives of a firm. Now, the next type of supply, market supply. Market supply, when we define market supply, you know the total produce which the producers are willing and able to sell in the market. Now, the determinants which we have explained in individual supply will be repeated as the determinants of market supply also. But for market supply, we have to learn 3 other determinants along with individual supply function. Okay. So, factors influencing the individual supply and market supply. For learning the factors influencing the market supply, we have to explain all the points from 1 to 6. Along with these points, there are other 3 more points which influences the market supply. Which are the other 3 points that you have to write? So, for exam, if the question is asked what are the factors which influences the market supply, you have to write the first 6 points of individual supply. Along with that, you have to add these 3 also. Now, market supply is influenced by the first 6 factors of individual supply plus 3. In that, number 1 is number of firms in the market. If the number of firms are more, supply also will be more. There will be more and more firms to supply in the market. So, if the number of firms are more, supply will be more. If the number of firms are less, supply will be less. Now, next one is future expectation regarding the price. Now, producers will have the production within their hands. But if they feel that for their product, the price is going to rise in the next week or next few weeks, or in the next period of time, they will hold their product and they will supply less at the present. More will be released when the price is more. Therefore, if they expect that the price is going to rise in the future, they will supply only less at present. Okay. Now, next one is good transportation and communication. In the places where there are good transportation and communication facilities, supply will be more. But in the very rural areas, you can find the transportation and communication is not up to the mark. In those places, supply will be delay and there will be less supply. So, supply and its effectiveness depends on the good transportation and communication. In fact, it means infrastructure facilities. So, when you write about the market supply, you have to include the first 6 factors of individual supply plus the 3 factors which we discussed now. So, hope this is clear to you. Now, next one is supply function. Just as demand function, supply function. What is supply function? Supply function refers to the functional relationship between the supply and factors affecting the supply. Just as we learned about, just now we learned about the factors affecting the supply. So, the relation between the price and the factors affecting the supply. The relationship, supply function is a functional relationship between the supply and factors affecting the supply. The functional relationship between supply and the factors affecting the supply. Now, there are 2 types of supply function. One is individual supply function and the second one is market supply function. Just as we learned for the demand, individual demand function and market demand function. What do we do in this supply function? We will represent what all factors affecting individual and market supply in the form of an equation. When we represent all the factors which determines the individual and the market supply in the form of an equation, we call it as supply function. In that, let us first write the individual supply function. To write down individual supply function, what we need? We need the factors influencing individual supply. What are the factors influencing the individual supply? Can you remember just now we learned objectives of a firm, state of technology, price of a good, prices of other goods, government policies, all these things we learned. If you represent that in the form of an equation, it becomes individual supply function. Along with these individual function, if you add the other 3, which are they? Number of firms, future expectation and good transportation. Along with that, and if you represent it in the form of an equation, it becomes market supply function. Now, let us write that. Individual supply function shows the functional relationship between individual supply and factors affecting individual supply. What are the factors influencing individual supply? So, how can we write this individual supply function? S is equal to, IS is equal to, individual supply is equal to F of, S is the function of PX, price of the commodity, PO, prices of other commodities. Just remember the example which I gave you for wheat and rice. Then prices of factors of production, raw materials, technology, government policies, tax and subsidies, O, objectives. So, S is the function of, if you want you can write IS. IS is the function of PX, P0, then PO, PF, T, G and O. Okay, this is all about individual supply function. Now, how will you define market supply function? You can take this. It shows the functional relationship between market supply and factors affecting market supply of a commodity. So, functional relationship between individual supply and factors affecting individual supply gives you individual supply function. Functional relationship between market supply and factors affecting the market supply will give you market supply function. How will you write market supply function then? If you want, you can write MS or SM or SI, any way you can write. However, it is easy for you to understand, you can write like that. Individual supply you can write it as SI, market supply you can write it as SM. Or if you are comfortable in writing like this, IS or MS, you can write like that, no problem. Okay, it depends on the way it is easier for you to understand. So here I have written it as SM, market supply function. SM is the function of PX, that is price of the good, PO, price of other good, PF, prices of factors of production, T, technology, G, government policy, O, objectives, plus the three other factors such as future expectation regarding the price, isn't it? F is future expectation regarding the price, then N is number of firms and M is means of transport. So, if you add all the individual supply factors plus these three F, M and N, you will get market supply function. So, when you represent this in the form of an equation, it becomes a function. So, all these are the topics which I want to discuss in this video. The definition of supply, two types of supply, individual and market supply, factors affecting individual and market supply, individual supply function and market supply function. Thank you.